Hey guys, everyone. I thought I'd show you my Thomas the Tank Engine Railway Series books by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry in this centenary library. So if we open it up, and I'll showcase all of the 26 books. So, we start at the beginning with the very first Railway Series book, which is The Three Railway Engines. Now, this was the first Railway Series book, and it was published in 1945 and introduced us to Edward, Gordon, and Henry. And of course, we have book number 2, which is Thomas the Tank Engine, which introduced us, of course, to the famous blue steam engine that everyone's come to know and love over the years. And this was published in 1946. And here's the third one, which is James the Red Engine, which is one of my favourites, which was Awdry's least favourite because he had to write it to meet a deadline. And this was published in 1947. And the next one is Tank Engine Thomas Again, which was published in 1949. And here's the fifth one, which is Troublesome Engines, where we see the introduction of Percy, and this was published in 1950. Handle these with care. And there's the next one, which is Henry the Green Engine, which is another one of my favourites. And this, of course, was published in 1951. Of course, the next one we have is, of course, we were introduced to Toby the Tram Engine in this book. And of course, this was published in 1952. And the next one, number 8, is, of course, Gordon the Big Engine, about the Big Blue Engine himself. And this book was published in 1953. And here's the next one, which is Edward the Blue Engine, which was published in 1954. And we also saw the introduction of Trevor the Traction Engine. This book. And the next one, this was published in 1955 and introduces us to the narrow gauge engines, Skarloey, Rheneas, Sir Handel, and Peter Sam. And the 11th book, Percy the Small Engine, which was published in 1956. And this book was also the last one to be illustrated by Clarence Reginald Dolby. Next up, we've got book number 12, which is the 8 famous engines, or it says 8 famous engines on the cover. And this was the first one to be illustrated by John T. Kenny, and it was published in 1957. And the next one, which is Duck and the Diesel Engine, which of course introduced us to Devious Diesel. And Eric Marriott, the editor of the books, insisted that Awdry introduced the character Diesel to keep the books up to date, as more diesels were seen on the British railways. And this book was published in 1958. And the second one, which is next one, which is The Little Old Engine, and this was our introduction to Rusty and Duncan, and this book was published in 1959. And the next one, which is The Twin Engines, and this of course introduced us to Donald and Douglas, the Scottish twins. and this book was published in 1960. Got the next one. Branch line engines, and that was our introduction to Daisy the Diesel Railcar, and this book was published in 1961. And here we have the next book, which is Gallant Old Engine, which was the final book to be illustrated by John T. Kenny, as his eyesight was beginning to fail at the time. And this book was published in 1962. Next up, we come to the last few books that were written by Awdry. And of course, here we have the first one, which is Stepney the Bluebell Engine. And of course, we knew who Stepney was. He was an engine from the Bluebell Railway. There he is right there. And of course, we also saw the introduction of Stepney and also Caroline the Car and the bowled-out diesel. And this book was published in 1963. And it was also the first book to be illustrated by Peter and Gunvor Edwards. And here we've got the next book, which is Mountain Engines, which was published in 1964, 60 years ago. And unfortunately, sadly, this was one of those books where the stories were not adapted for the television series. Which is a shame, because Mountain Engines is the only time that we saw the Culdee Fell Railway. And the next one, which is Very Old Engines, which was published in 1965. And just like its predecessor, Mountain Engines, none of its stories were adapted for television. And this book, of course, you see, talks about Skarloey's life when he first came to the island. And our next one, which is a bit of a misnomer, which is Mainline Engines, which we see the introduction of Bill, Ben, and Boko, and this book was published in 1966. I forgot to point out, Very Old Engines was published in 1965. Now the next one, which is one of my good one, Small Railway Engines, which was published in 1967, which coincidentally the events of the stories take place in that year. And of course we got introduced to Rex, Mike and Bert, the small miniature engines. I didn't know these were not adapted for the television series until the 20th series, with the exception of Ballast. So they were introduced in the Lost Treasure movie. And yeah, of course, there's one of my favourite ones, Enterprising Engines. And why is it my favourite? Because the Flying Scotsman appears in that book. And this book was published in 1968, even though the stories are set in 1967. And 1968 was the year that steam was officially withdrawn from British Railways. There's the next one, which is Oliver the Western Engine, which was published in 1969. And of course was, brings us to, of course, Oliver was introduced in its predecessor, Enterprising Engines. And then, of course, we've got the second to last one, which is Duke the Lost Engine, which introduces us to Duke and shows us the life on the Mid-Sodor Railway. And we've got the 26th, and Wilbur Awdry's, which was Wilbur Awdry's final railway series book, Tramway Engines, which introduced us to Mavis. It was also Wilbur Awdry's final book, and it was published in 1972. I forgot to mention, Oliver the Western Engine was published in 1969, and Duke the Lost Engine was published in 1970. There. And now that's all of Wilbur Awdry's books, in a nutshell.